$5 billion. That was the cash surplus the Miami branch of the Federal Reserve reported in 1981. Not assets, not deposits, not electronic transfers, physical currency, paper bills stacked in vaults, crammed into counting machines with nowhere to go. Every other Federal Reserve branch in the United States was running a deficit. The national economy was in recession. Unemployment was climbing past 10%. Factories were shuttering across the Rust Belt. And Miami, a city with no major manufacturing base, no Fortune 500 headquarters, no obvious reason to be awash in cash, had more physical money flowing through its banking system than New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles combined. The analysts ran the numbers again. The numbers held. The surplus didn't correspond to any known economic activity, not tourism, not agriculture, not international trade. And for years, nobody with the authority to investigate seemed particularly interested in asking why. That money didn't evaporate. It went into the ground, into concrete and rebar and imported marble, into glass towers that rose along a single avenue in downtown Miami, towers that still stand today, still catch the sunrise over Biscayne Bay, still appear on every postcard and real estate listing the city produces. The Skyline tourists' photograph from cruise ships was not built by the forces that typically build American cities. It was built by something else, entirely. In the mid-1970s, Miami was a city running out of reasons to exist. The opening of Walt Disney World in 1971 had redirected the domestic tourism pipeline to Orlando. The retirees who had sustained the local economy for decades were aging out, and younger Americans weren't replacing them. Brickell Avenue, the waterfront corridor south of the Miami River, was still lined with aging mansions, its old money residents dying off and their heirs selling. The neighborhood's nickname was Millionaires Row, but the millionaires were leaving. The city's tax base was shrinking. Its infrastructure was dated. The legitimate economy offered two things: a deep water port and proximity to Latin America. Those were geographic facts, not economic engines. Miami had no skyline to speak of. It had no international banking sector. On paper, it looked like a city that would spend the next 2 decades slowly fading into irrelevance, another Sunbelt town living off its past. What happened instead was one of the fastest urban transformations in American history, and the capital that funded it didn't come from Wall Street, or from Washington, or from any source that has ever appeared in a textbook. It arrived in suitcases, in cardboard boxes, in rope-handled shopping bags carried through the front doors of banks that never once asked where it came from. Miami sits closer to Bogota than to Washington, D.C. By the late 1970s, Colombian trafficking organizations had established South Florida as the primary entry point for cocaine into the American market. At the peak, roughly 70% of all cocaine consumed in the United States passed through the South Florida corridor. The product generated cash, enormous, unmanageable quantities of small denomination bills that could not be spent, invested, or moved without first entering the banking system. The banking system was ready. A federal law called the EDGE Act, passed in 1919, allowed the creation of specialized bank subsidiaries authorized to handle only international transactions. These EDGE Act banks were subject to lighter domestic oversight than traditional retail institutions. They existed, on paper, to facilitate cross-border trade. In the late 1970s, dozens of them opened on Brickell Avenue. By the peak of the boom, the corridor hosted over 40 American international banks and more than 30 foreign branches, the highest concentration of international banking institutions in the country, packed onto a single stretch of waterfront road. The official narrative was that Miami was becoming the gateway to Latin America, a hub for legitimate capital-fleeing political instability in Venezuela, Argentina, and Colombia. And legitimate flight capital did flow through Miami. Wealthy Latin Americans were parking money in Florida real estate to protect it from inflation and regime change. This was real, and it was legal, and it created the perfect cover. Because when every other depositor walking through the door claims to be a businessman from Bogota, the one carrying a duffel bag full of 10s and 20s doesn't look particularly unusual. The first stage of the laundering process was crude. Under the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970, any cash deposit over $10,000 required a currency transaction report filed with the federal government. The law was designed to create a paper trail. In practice, it created a business opportunity. Couriers, dozens of them, working daily circuits across the city, visited branch after branch, depositing amounts carefully kept below the threshold. Different names, different accounts, sometimes different branches of the same bank. The technique was called structuring, and it was happening at an industrial scale, but the volume quickly exceeded what structuring could handle. At the Great American Bank of Dade County, the operation moved past subtlety altogether. A vice president named Lionel Paytube personally supervised counting rooms where traffickers' cash was processed through high-speed machines, not in back alleys or warehouses, but inside the bank itself during business hours. The bills arrived dirty, damp, sometimes still carrying the chemical smell of the product they'd been stored alongside. The tellers processed them anyway. The bank charged fees on every dollar it absorbed. At Capital Bank, a single account, logged under the name Sonal, processed $242 million in 8 months. The question was never whether the banks knew where the money came from. The question was how much they were willing to charge for not asking. Once the cash entered the banking system, it needed somewhere to go. Wire transfers sent it offshore to Panama, the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, where it cycled through shell corporations created by Miami law firms. The shells existed only on paper. No employees, no offices, no products. Their sole function was to receive a wire transfer from one jurisdiction and send it to another, adding a layer of distance between the cash and its source with every hop. A single deposit might pass through 3 or 4 offshore entities in less than 72 hours, each transfer scrubbing another layer of origin from the funds. Then, the money came home. It returned to Miami as loans and investments, clean documented capital ready to be deployed into the legitimate economy. And the economy it chose was real estate. The rezoning of Brickell Avenue was already underway. The old mansions were being demolished, the lots subdivided, the zoning codes rewritten to permit high-density commercial and residential towers. Miami's municipal government, desperate to revitalize a declining city, welcomed every new project. Every tower meant construction jobs, property tax revenue, and the appearance of a city on the rise. The developers moved fast. Construction crews worked around the clock to pour foundations and raise steel. Accounts from the period describe contractors cutting corners to meet impossible timelines, structural shortcuts that prioritized completion speed over building integrity, because the priority was never the building itself. The priority was converting liquid capital into a fixed asset as quickly as possible. A $50 million condominium tower, once completed and sold, was no longer drug money. It was real estate. The architecture of the boom reflected its economics. Developers needed buildings that would attract buyers willing to pay premium prices in cash. No questions asked. This demanded audacity, structures that announced themselves. A young firm called Arquitectonica delivered exactly that. Their most famous creation rose at 2025 Brickell Avenue between 1980 and 1982. A 20-story condominium called the Atlantis, built on a plot only 37 feet wide. The building's defining feature was a 5-story void carved out of its center, an open-air sky court containing a single palm tree, a red spiral staircase, and a jacuzzi. The design was almost absurd. It was also instantly iconic. When the producers of Miami Vice went looking for an image that captured the new city, they put the Atlantis in the opening credits. The building became the visual shorthand for Miami's reinvention, broadcast into living rooms across the world every Friday night. The pastel suits, the waterfront, the glass towers, all of it presented as aspirational style. The Atlantis itself was developed by a legitimate firm, but the economic ecosystem that made Brickell viable, the banking density, the liquidity, the buyers willing to pay cash for units they might never occupy, was inseparable from the narco-economy that had flooded the corridor with capital. While the rest of the United States was suffering through the worst recession since the Great Depression, unemployment above 10%, manufacturing hollowed out across the industrial Midwest, Miami was experiencing what economists would later call a narco-Keynesian stimulus. The effect was identical to a massive government spending program, except the funding source was cocaine, and the oversight was non-existent. Exotic car dealerships multiplied along U.S. Route 1. Nightclubs and restaurants opened to serve a clientele with limitless disposable income. Between 1978 and 1985, the Miami Home Price Index rose roughly 75%, while the rest of the country stagnated. 12 individuals in Miami were each depositing more than $250 million annually into non-interest-bearing checking accounts, exposed to the full cost of inflation with no return on their money. No legitimate depositor in the history of American banking has ever voluntarily done this. Between 1979 and 1982, the homicide rate in Miami-Dade County more than tripled. The medical examiner's office ran out of room for the dead. The county rented a refrigeration truck from Burger King to store the overflow. Territorial disputes between trafficking organizations played out in shopping malls and parking lots. The Dadeland Mall shootout of 1979, a broad daylight attack inside a liquor store that spilled into the parking lot, marked the moment the drug war became impossible to ignore. The gunman drove a reinforced van equipped with body armor and automatic weapons. The Miami police had never encountered anything like it. In November 1981, Time magazine put the city on its cover under the headline, "Paradise Lost." The story described a place consumed by violence, drugs, and institutional failure. Reading it, you'd think Miami was finished. But behind the magazine cover, the cranes on Brickell Avenue never stopped. The municipal government was not an innocent bystander. In 1988, Miami-Dade County Commissioners voted to name a 6-block stretch of road Leomer Parkway, honoring Leonel Martinez, one of the most prominent real estate developers in the region. Martinez had built shopping centers and apartment complexes. He donated to local charities. He was exactly the kind of civic-minded businessman a growing city celebrates. 2 years later, the signs came down. Martinez had pleaded guilty to importing 300 kilograms of cocaine, hidden inside shipments of guava paste, routed through the same port that supplied his construction materials. His mansion in the gated community of Cocoplum contained a secret basement nightclub, a private venue with a stage, a bar, and seating for 100 people, built entirely below ground. The street that bore his name was quietly redesignated, and the county never publicly addressed how it had come to honor one of the largest drug importers in South Florida history. The fracture began where it should have begun years earlier, inside the Federal Reserve. When Treasury Department analysts first identified the cash surplus in 1979, they struggled to convince senior officials in Washington that the numbers were real. The data suggested that a single American city was absorbing more physical currency than the rest of the national banking system could account for. The implication was staggering. The drug trade was no longer just a criminal justice problem. It was a macroeconomic event, distorting the national money supply itself. The response was Operation Greenback, the first federal task force designed to attack drug trafficking through its financial infrastructure rather than its supply chain. Launched in 1980, Greenback combined agents from the IRS, Customs, and the Department of Justice. Their approach was not to chase drugs, but to chase paper. They pulled currency transaction reports. They subpoenaed wire transfer records. They mapped the flow of deposits across dozens of institutions. What they found was institutional complicity on a scale that redefined the government's understanding of money laundering. The Great American Bank wasn't a victim of sophisticated criminal infiltration. Its vice president had built the counting rooms. Its tellers had been trained to process the deposits. The bank was indicted in 1982 for laundering $94 million and eventually pleaded guilty. Not a rogue employee, not a single bad actor, but the institution itself. By October 1982, Greenback had produced over 100 arrests, but the legal tools available to prosecutors were painfully limited. Money laundering was not yet a federal crime. Agents could charge suspects with failing to file currency reports, a paperwork violation, or with conspiracy, which required proving a direct connection to the drug trade. The gap between what investigators knew and what they could prosecute was enormous. That gap closed in 1986 when Congress passed the Money Laundering Control Act. For the first time, the act of knowingly processing the proceeds of criminal activity through the financial system became a standalone federal offense. Structuring deposits to avoid reporting thresholds became a specific crime. Asset forfeiture provisions allowed the government to seize property purchased with illicit funds. The legislation gave prosecutors the ability to target the financial architecture itself, not just the drugs it served. The effect was immediate. Indictments cascaded through the Miami banking corridor. Isaac Catan, the Colombian national who had operated as the primary financial broker between the trafficking organizations and the Miami banking sector, had already been arrested in 1981 after surveillance uncovered $40 million in cash spread across his residence and 4 hotel rooms. He received 30 years. The Coronas, a father-son team who had turned their institution, Sunshine State Bank, into a full-service laundering operation, were convicted of racketeering. The bank was shuttered by regulators. Its ordinary depositors left to discover that their savings had sat alongside cartel revenue in the same vault. But the crackdown revealed something the federal government hadn't fully anticipated. The narco-economy wasn't a parasite feeding on a healthy host. It was the host. When the cash flow contracted, the consequences rippled outward through every sector it had inflated. Banks sustained by laundering fees and deposit volume began to fail. Real estate prices, untethered from organic demand since the late 1970s, corrected sharply. Construction stalled. The boom that had made Miami the envy of recession-era America revealed itself for what it had always been, an economy built on a commodity that was never supposed to be there. The correction was real, but it was temporary. The Skyline was not. The glass towers that rose along Brickell Avenue between 1978 and 1990 did not come down when the indictments came through. The condominiums did not dissolve when their original buyers went to prison. The banking infrastructure, the Edge Act subsidiaries, the international branches, the law firms that had structured the shell corporations, contracted, but did not disappear. The physical city that drug money had built became the foundation for the legitimate city that followed. The historical consensus on this period is uncomfortable but largely uncontested. Drug money functioned as the capital that allowed Miami to skip a generation of organic economic development. The city that was dying in 1975, losing tourists to Orlando, losing relevance to every Sunbelt competitor with a warmer climate and a lower tax rate, became, by 1990, a globally recognized financial center. The transition required tens of billions of dollars in investment, and a significant portion of that investment originated in the coca fields of Colombia, passed through the banking corridor of Brickell Avenue, and solidified into the concrete and glass that tourists photograph today. And the institutional habits persisted longer than anyone in Washington wanted to admit. In 2011, nearly 3 decades after Operation Greenback, Ocean Bank, the largest privately owned commercial bank in Florida, was charged with willfully failing to maintain an anti-money laundering program. The red flags were familiar: unusually large cash deposits, wire transfers from Mexican currency exchange houses, a compliance culture that treated due diligence as an obstacle to revenue. The specific actors had changed. The institutional pattern had not. The regulatory framework that now governs global banking, know your customer protocols, anti-money laundering standards, suspicious activity reports, was born in the aftermath of what happened on Brickell Avenue. The failures of the Great American Bank and Sunshine State and Capital Bank didn't just produce criminal convictions. They produce the architecture of modern financial compliance. Every time a bank anywhere in the world asks where your money came from, the question traces back to a decade when Miami's banks didn't ask at all. The Atlantis still stands at 2025 Brickell Avenue. Its Sky Court, the 5-story void with the palm tree and the red staircase, is still the most recognizable architectural feature in the city. The cranes are up again on Brickell. The towers are taller now, the glass panels wider. The price per square foot among the highest in the country. The avenue that was Millionaire's Row, then a crime corridor, then a symbol of narco-funded excess, is now simply one of the most expensive stretches of real estate in the Western Hemisphere. That skyline is the scar, and the money has been washed so many times it doesn't even smell anymore. Miami's skyline is one of the most photographed in America. Every year, millions of visitors see it from the water, from the causeway, from the windows of planes descending into Miami International Airport. What they're looking at is the physical residue of a financial system that processed more illicit cash than any other in American history, a system that wasn't hidden in the shadows but operated through the front doors of licensed banks, approved by regulators, and celebrated by a city government that never asked the obvious question. The buildings remain. The compliance rules written because of what happened here are now global standard, but the fundamental tension between a city's desire for growth and its willingness to examine where that growth comes from didn't end in the 1980s. It just moved to a higher floor. What other cities were built, at least in part, by money that was never supposed to be there? Drop your answer in the comments. Some of the responses to that question tend to be more interesting than the videos themselves.